What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, when I say the word suburbs, I mean, what comes to mind for you?
Suburbs is quiet. Quiet would be the word I would say. Quiet.
Peaceful.
Relax. Yes.
Tranquility.
You got it.
My own piece of the world. Right?
Until they start those lawnmowers up.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, some people might use terms like uniformity, conformity, white picket fences, well-manicured lawns, people fleeing the city to get away from, quote-unquote, the others. And, of course, we remember that song that Carole King wrote for the great group The Monkees, Pleasant Valley Sunday, where she talked about, well, it may not be on the surface exactly what it looks like because there's a lot of things going on. And Mr. Smith may be meeting up with Miss Jones, and there are things going on in the suburbs of a different nature than is usually advertised. So maybe suburbs are a little deceptive. Maybe, in fact, people have a perception of the suburbs that is not wholly accurate. In our state, and we are coming to you from Connecticut, we bought into the suburban solution pretty hard and pretty fast many years ago. But it's interesting, John, because you and I live in a suburb, arguably.
Right.
But it's an inner ring suburb, and they're different than the outer ring suburbs. Ours isn't a real wealthy suburb by any means. A lot of working class people.
It's a nice area, though.
It's nice, but our zoning is a little less restrictive than other places. And they all have their own character, their own feel. But if you and I went to, well, we're in Connecticut. If we went to Lyme, let's say the town of Lyme, we would think about an artist colony because there's a lot of artists there.
Right, that's true.
Yeah, and so it has a whole different feel and texture than our suburb. And that's what's really interesting about this next podcast. Amanda Kolson Hurley, in her book, Radical Suburbs. And, you say to yourself, wait a minute, radical suburbs.
That's what I said, radical.
I know, it doesn't seem as if they necessarily go together, like that wasp that's in our studio right now.
He's pretty radical.
Okay, well, I hope he will stay radically above the fray. So if I begin to talk very quickly at this introduction, please understand the reason that I'm doing that. But the book is called, again, Radical Suburbs, Experimental Living on the Fringes of the American City. And Amanda Kolson Hurley wrote this wonderful book, and she points out that waves of idealists establish these little living laboratories that have really no resemblance to what we envision suburbs as being today, John.
Huh.
Some very unusual.
I didn't realize anybody actually designed these places.
Well, they kind of came about because certain people were looking not to be part of a cloister in a city. They wanted to get out and practice their own lifestyle. Let's put it that way.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a little different.
I never thought about it that way.
I know. And when you think about it, this is really important because she reminds us, and we do talk a lot about suburbs today, that in fact I think it's about 52% of the people in America live in a suburb. So we're talking about a place that, well, half of you who are listening can really relate to, or maybe you're planning to move out to a suburb and you need to recognize they're not all the same. Absolutely.
No, that's for sure.
All right. Let's get to it right now on America Trends. With us on the line is Amanda Kolson Hurley, and the book is called Radical Suburbs, Experimental Living on the Fringes of the American City. The last thing that I think most people consider suburbs to be is radical. If I remember the song by Carole King, Pleasant Valley Sunday, and everybody's out doing the same things and mowing their little postage stamp lawns, and everybody's conforming to some ethic that everybody shares. So why radical suburbs?
That's a good question, and I've told people more than once, no, the title of the book is not an oxymoron. In fact, there is this image that I think most of us have that's been kind of fed to us through popular culture and reinforced over decades. Suburbia as this very kind of monocultural, formist place, a place where, you move to if you just kind of want to settle into a routine of being, just like the people who live next door and across the street. And what I found looking through the history of the American suburbs was something a little different. There's actually this long tradition of people, founding these nonconformist or kind of alternative communities or trying out new ideas in architecture and urban planning in suburban places outside of cities, often because it was cheaper than trying to do that in the city, or there was, more available land that wasn't built up if you wanted to build a new community. So, the communities I write about, that was certainly not typical in suburbia. It was a kind of continuous element, I'd say, in suburban living, a kind of a thread running through American history.
And I do want to get to some of those interesting experiments that you share with us, particularly the celibates. We'll talk about that later, but we'll intrigue our audience. But 52% of the people in the United States, you remind us, live in the suburbs today. And yet we do see this push back into the cities, and millennials are suggesting that they want this congregate living. They want something a little bit different than what the suburbs do offer. And is that a temporary refuge for a lot of these kids who really ultimately might come out to the suburbs, or will the suburbs have to change a whole lot in order to take the place of what they're experiencing in their 20s in the cities?
Yeah, well, that's sort of the $64,000 question. And I know that scholars have debated back and forth, whether this is kind of a blip and, millennials and Generation Z will eventually find their way back to the suburbs in droves like their parents and grandparents did, or whether this is the beginning of a larger, longer-term shift toward more urban styles of living. And I think in some ways the return to the city has been a little bit overstated, but I think there is evidence that there's at least something of a longer shift in kind of what people value in communities, what they're looking for. And there are a number of surveys that show that, and I think actually some kind of quantitative, research by scholars showing that millennials do choose kind of more urban locations, and sometimes that's kind of an urban part of a suburb. Sometimes it's in the city. They do choose those type of locations or value those type of locations more than past generations did at the same point in their lives. So I think that there is a little bit of a value reset going on. I think we can say that at this point, and I think it really raises this larger question of what is the role of the suburbs then? Because I think that suburban leaders and probably home builders and developers kind of rested on their laurels for a while thinking, well, we have a captive market. So the minute that people have kids and want a little more space, they'll be moving here. We'll be growing and attracting people with good incomes and attracting jobs, and that's started to become a little less clear. So I think this is actually a perfect time for a lot of suburbs to kind of start asking themselves larger questions about, if our traditional appeal is maybe not as strong as it once was. What do we need to do to change?
Well, if 52% of the people in America still live in what is called suburbia, is that a number that's down from a much higher number, or is that generally where America has been? I mean, we've got obviously a rural America that has really been sounding out lately about some of their concerns. We do have the urban America. The squishiest part of America has to be the suburbs, because to me there are inner suburbs, inner ring, then outer ring, and then areas that used to be rural that are now suburbanized. So it keeps growing, the suburban part of the concentric circle.
Absolutely, yeah. There are so many different types of suburbs, and depending on the type of suburb and also just what metropolitan region they're in. They can be very different and also kind of face different challenges. So, in inner suburbs, you have some inner suburbs that are adjacent to quite big and prosperous cities that, are very desirable places to live. Where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, actually DC has a lot of, very, very affluent and growing and dynamic kind of suburban areas right around the central city. Other inner suburbs maybe were built a little bit later. Some of them are kind of struggling as people move back to the city and as people kind of leapfrog those inner suburbs and they move to newer, often kind of bigger houses, in the exurbs. So the exurbs are kind of different from those older suburbs in that they tend to have newer housing stock. A lot of people are drawn to that. The newer houses tend to be bigger. If a community is new, often there isn't that much traffic or noise. And so people move there thinking, this is very attractive to me in terms of everything being new and
Amanda, let's be honest.
But
Let's be honest about it. There are certain people who have been city dwellers, and then they or their families, maybe the last generation, moved out because they became more prosperous and they didn't want to live next to certain kinds of people, so they moved to the inner ring suburbs. And then when the inner ring suburbs started to oftentimes integrate, and I know in the state of Connecticut, where we bought into the suburban solution harder and faster than most, the only integrated parts of our state are the inner ring suburbs. But that has caused more, if I should say, white flight into these outer ring suburbs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem is this kind of successive white flight to outermost, ever further out rings of the metropolitan area. And one of the reasons that I wrote my book was to kind of look at how different suburbs have dealt with that over time. And I found that there is this other tradition of, I guess, just kind of very thoughtful and conscious attempts at racial and socioeconomic integration. A number of the places that I write about really tried to include different types of places where someone without that much money and then someone who was quite well off could live in the same community. They made some very kind of deliberate attempts at racial integration as well. Sometimes, earlier than you might expect in the, early 1950s. So, I think from that, a lot of those attempts, were not 100% successful, but they do seem to work. It certainly does seem to be more effective than doing nothing and then kind of wondering, gosh, why have so many people, suddenly moved out, or, why is there a lot of racial tension in our community? And I think that that's, just an important thing for a lot of suburban places to try to be proactive about.
Absolutely. But would you say, and again, you have some incredibly interesting experiments in suburban life in the book, and we will talk about those. But you also say, because you say a lot of interesting things in this book, that normative American suburb, and by normative, I guess we're all talking about the ones that look kind of the same, and the ones that have that openness and have the white picket fences, and, I hate to say this, but exclusionary zoning, they are ill-suited to how we live in the 21st century. So, I mean, while we may all be fascinated with some of these experiments, this is the norm, at least the one that we see portrayed on television and the one that many of us live in. I live in a small suburb, and it's somewhat exclusionary, not upscale, but exclusionary.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I should probably add to that remark I make in the book that I think there is certainly a kind of segment of the population for whom a 3 or 4 bedroom single family home in a quieter community works with where you maybe can't drive to a lot of stuff. I think that still is going to be attractive and work well for certain people and a number of families, but the suburbs were built at a time when the proportion of Americans who were married adults with young children in the household was really high. I mean, it was, 40% in that region. I mean, it was really probably the biggest single demographic group.
Exactly.
And now that same share of the population has decreased to 20%. So really, if you're building homes, as I think a lot of the major home builders who build suburban subdivisions are, if you're building it, or if you're an urban planner planning a development in an ex-urban region and thinking, okay, I'm going to, who's going to be moving here? It's going to be, 37-year-old mom, dad, and their 8 and 6-year-old kids. I mean, that's maybe not realistic anymore, given that that's a pretty small share of the population. We have a lot more single-person households. We have a lot more households where there's 2 people living together. Maybe it's, a couple without children, or an adult mother and adult child, or a single parent headed household. So, there really aren't that many options for people, especially, if they just have one income, because housing has become so expensive. And I do think that we're seeing part of this back to the city trend that we've been seeing is a response to the fact that we've just been building too much of the same thing in the suburbs. And maybe people don't hate suburbs. It's just too much of that thing that works well for some people, but just not for everyone.
Exactly. And in your book, I love the fact that you talk about this mismatch, that many of the distant suburbs are growing the fastest with these 2,600 square foot homes and larger. Mm-hmm. But that's not necessarily the market of the future. Interestingly, as much as Connecticut, and I'm using that because we live here, has been an example of, these 1 acre lots and septic tanks and everything else, and keeping a lot of poor folks out and not having great transportation options, a whole range of things that can be exclusionary. We're also trying some very interesting co-op living opportunities. I know in Bethany, Connecticut, they're building this multi-generational, almost a communal setting where older folks can take care of younger kids, and while the parents are off to work. There's another setting in Oxford, Connecticut, where they've got a planned little community right in the center of town, creating a new town square that never existed. So I know that these experiments are taking place. What do you think they're based on? I mean, give us a couple of the examples of some of the planned communities of the past that you found most interesting and you put in your book, Radical Suburbs.
Yeah, well, those 2 examples in Connecticut actually sound very promising and interesting. Yeah, so, I mean, a couple of the examples, in terms of a multi-generational community, I think a great example of that is Reston, Virginia, which was founded in the mid-1960s. And it was a suburb that was kind of intended to be like the anti-suburb. A very interesting developer came down from New York, and he was actually the heir to a real estate family fortune, but he sold his family's share in Carnegie Hall to finance the construction of this new town. It's pretty interesting. But he had this idea of a town that would be more like a European town, where you would have stores around a plaza, and there might be apartments on top of those stores, and people would walk, and there would be kind of nature interwoven with the streets and the houses, and that he wanted to make a town where you could live at every stage in your life. So, you would be able to find a home that's big enough while you're raising a family for your children, and then, as they flew the nest, you'd be able to downsize to something smaller and maybe something closer into the kind of center of the town. So I think Reston is a really good example of that. He didn't quite pull off the vision, in as purely as he conceived it, but it's still, I'd say, a little bit different from other suburbs, and people there are just really immensely proud of living somewhere that had this idealism behind it, and they take that very seriously. Another interesting example, and these are kind of the case studies bookending the book, and that you mentioned before, was this celibate religious sect.
Now, first of all, I don't know. Yeah. That's a hard one to get our arms around. But tell us about this community.
Yeah, it's pretty pretty wild. So it was this religious sect from Germany. They came over in the early 19th century. They had, I guess, their leaders were being persecuted by the authorities there because they were kind of religious dissenters. So they came to the United States, and they kind of moved around, and they built a few communities. But the one that I focus on is in what is now Ambridge, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Pittsburgh. It's, I think, about 12 miles from Pittsburgh. And they built this kind of extraordinary town. When you think of people on the kind of frontier, you know, building a communal, I don't know, a communal living situation in the 1820s, you probably wouldn't think of a place like this. Really kind of handsome brick buildings, everything laid out very regularly. But they had a couple of things that really set them apart. First of all, they did not believe in private property. And when you joined this group, you kind of signed this legal document that said everything I own is just going into the common trove, you know. So if you needed new clothes or anything for your house, there was a store, and you would just go and they'd give it to you and, you know, mark it off in the ledger or whatnot. And everybody had a job, and they were actually incredibly financially successful. They manufactured a lot of different goods, including silk. They were very well known for their silks. But you know, so as they were, you know, becoming very prosperous in this nice town, they were also celibate. I mean, that's the kind of other thing. They did not believe in private property.
Well, they had a lot of time then for the commerce.
That's true. They had a lot of time for the commerce, and they also quite liked music. And I'm sure they had other pursuits, but yeah, they did not. Right, they thought it was a more godly thing to live in celibacy, and so they shared these houses. They lived together in these houses that, in kind of an early suburban, kind of ironically, you know, I guess looking forward to the suburbs of the future, they were very similar. They just kind of lined the street, very identical looking houses, but they lived there kind of in group house fashion because, you know, they didn't really have kids at this point. So
and
you would
it didn't seem likely going forward if they were living up to the creed. No. Well, Amanda, let me ask you, though. I mean, we were talking, John and I, before we set about putting the mics up today, about Fairfield, Connecticut, for example, and I want to bring that to that's a community now, and a lot of people identify Connecticut with Fairfield, and it is, you know, one of the closest in suburbs, or is, to Bridgeport, which is somewhat of a dying city, though they're trying to revive it, and all Connecticut cities have been troubled to one extent or another. How important is the oxygen from the city to the suburb, or how do these suburbs do on their own when they're actually in many ways stronger than the city from which they come? Because you remind us that even where you live in Montgomery County, Maryland, you've got these suburbanites speaking many languages, you've got rent modest apartments, you've got buses and transit, and it's not lily white. And Fairfield, for example, I mean, has a lot of activity. It's got apartments, it's got universities. So, I mean, how important is the vitality of the city with which it is connected?
I think that vitality is pretty important. And I think that, you know, in my book, the 6 case studies I look at, 2 of them are in the D.C. region, one of them is outside Pittsburgh, one of them is outside Philly, and another is outside Boston. So, you know, looking at those different cities, you can see that the religious sect I was just talking about, their former community, it's now a historic site, but it's in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, which was an industrial suburb of Pittsburgh. And it's sort of, Ambridge has sort of fallen on hard times. I think, you know, they're trying to come back. And as Pittsburgh has seen a little bit of a reversal of its fortunes, I think, over the last 10 or 15 years. And it does seem like Ambridge is starting to turn some things around, and it's interesting that there are people who have moved to Ambridge. I discovered through my research, because they like the fact that it feels kind of urban, even though you're out in you're in the suburbs. That they can walk there, and that's partly the legacy of this religious group, the Harmonists, kind of laying everything out very much as a traditional town. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly I think a place like Reston that I mentioned earlier. That was built way out towards near the international airport. When it was built in the 60s, people thought, why is this crazy guy coming here and building this town out in the boondocks? But because Washington has grown so much and the economy has been so strong, that expansion reached all the way out to where Reston was and has really kind of buoyed it. And I think that, I think a place like that would have struggled in a metropolitan area that had a weaker economy or slower growth. And in fact, there are examples of new towns. I think especially in the 1970s, there were plans for more new towns like Reston, and for various reasons, they did not really come to fruition. But I think some of them were not in very thriving regions, and that was
yeah. And I think a lot of us read about those in sociology courses. That here they're going to be utopia. I mean, that's what it was meant to be. Radical Suburbs: Experimental Living on the Fringes of the American City. Amanda Kolson Hurley is with us. Amanda, you also say a couple of things that I really want to get in front of our audience. You say we could be in the middle of a great inversion. Cities rich and down-market suburbs. The inversion, explain that.
Yeah, well, this is a concept that is not mine. It was that term was coined by a writer named Alan Ehrenholt. But he wrote a book, it might actually be about 10 years ago now, sort of predicting that, this pattern that we've seen, certainly since World War II, but even before that, where, cities had a lot of poverty and a lot of crime, and suburbs were sort of the chosen place where people with means would go, that were safe, that were prosperous. That pattern, you could call it a kind of donut, right? The donut pattern. But that was sort of starting to invert, and so that now people are choosing to move back to the city, and it's very expensive to live in the city. Increasingly, people might want to live in the city, and they realize they can't afford it anymore. So then you get people, because of gentrification, people with less money, being pushed out to the suburbs, and so the suburbs are not really necessarily the place of first choice anymore. So that was kind of I think a very buzzy theory when it was proposed. And, is that actually what's happening? I think in the book I say it's not crystal clear, but I think that it's quite possible that things are going in that direction. I don't think we can rule it out. And as I said before, I think, there's enough evidence to convince me that millennials are more likely to prefer an urban environment over their parents at the same age, and I think that is reshaping things in a significant way that's not just temporary.
You also say that suburban jurisdictions are already adapting to changes as urban burbs. And
some of them.
Yeah, some of them. How does that morph? Generally, is it from the outside in or inside out? In other words, where certain parts of a city really become their own suburban ring around the city, or is it that various suburbs grow into and interlock with the adjacent city? How does that normally happen?
Well, I think when these suburbs are urbanizing, I think that it often happens sort of because of, I don't know if outside pressure is the right term to use exactly, but because there's so much growth in the region that, often, the leaders of the jurisdiction are saying, how can we get a piece of this pie, right? And maybe they're looking over to the city and saying, well, gosh, they're getting all this new development, obviously new tax revenues, right, from having new residents and stores and jobs, and, we want some of that too. I think, another factor is developers in these prosperous places looking for new territory, right? And that, maybe there aren't so many sites in the city anymore, but there's a really promising looking site of, what used to be a mall or a strip mall or something like that that they think has potential to be redeveloped in an urban way. So I think I've seen some examples of suburbs kind of trying from the inside out, just saying we want to be more urban. And I think there was an example actually out in Arizona. I don't want to say the name of the place because I might get it wrong. But,
okay, or I thought you meant everybody might run there and start to live there. In closing, in closing, you say that there are misinformed cliches that still define suburbia, and that drives you crazy. What do you want people to think about in terms of Americans and our suburban life and our propensity to live more in the suburbs? I mean, at least by a majority. It might have even been more in the past. But what do you think really defines that, and why are we mischaracterizing these communities?
The book is not prescriptive. I'm not saying that the suburbs, should look any particular way, or that people should live there any particular way. Really, my hope in writing the book was just to kind of expand our definition of what suburbia can look like, and the ways that people can live there, and the options for changing it in the future. I think that people tend to get, a little bit fatalistic or defeatist about the suburbs, and people make just a lot of assumptions. Well, people in the suburbs are conservative, they don't like change, or, they wouldn't like, if you
somebody living next door or whatever.
Well, right, or, you could get a great architect to build a nice new art center in the suburb, and, people would still say, well, it's the suburbs, maybe they wouldn't care about that, or they wouldn't value it, and I just, I think that when you go back through the history of the suburbs, there's actually a lot of evidence to counter that, and that, there has always been experimentation and creativity and a much greater diversity of opinion and values than people assume. So I'm hoping that the book can kind of, free up a kind of, a looser and, less constrained look at suburbia and what's possible for it in the future.
And I agree. I mean, there are so many forms of suburbia. My sister lives now in Cary, which is outside of Raleigh, Durham. And I've got to tell you, they're building their own art center, all kinds of activities, recreation, culture. I mean, it really is a place where you can live. And while you're related to Raleigh, you can certainly have a great life and a very interesting life and a diverse life. I mean, they brought us to one of their museums in Cary, and it was fantastic. So I do understand exactly what you're saying. Amanda Kolson Hurley, Radical Suburbs, Experimental Living on the Fringes of the American City. Just a pleasure to have you with us today on America Trends.
Oh, I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.